Stop replaying the scene. It weakens the decree. A moving image feels productive, but it divides power. Freeze the moment instead. What is still declares, "This is finished." And consciousness obeys what feels final. Most people never realize that the very thing they believe is helping them manifest is quietly weakening their imaginal power. They sit in silence, close their eyes, and begin to watch their desire unfold like a movie, adding movement, dialogue, adjustments, and emotional corrections, convinced that more activity equals more effectiveness. But beneath this habit lies a subtle lie, the assumption that imagination must do something in order to create. In truth, this constant motion is not creativity at all. It is interference. What appears productive is often nothing more than restless attention, searching for reassurance. Neville repeatedly pointed to a principle so simple that the mind overlooks it. Attention, not effort, is the creative force. Attention is not strain, and it is not repetition. It is the quiet, sustained resting of consciousness upon a single assumption. When the imaginal act becomes a moving sequence, attention fractures. Each adjustment implies doubt, each correction implies incompletion, and each new version subtly confesses that the end has not yet been accepted. The power was never in how vivid the scene looked, but in how unwavering the awareness behind it remained. This is why so many imaginal acts feel exhausting instead of natural. The practitioner keeps fixing the image, polishing it, replaying it, improving it, as though imagination were a broken mechanism that must be forced into working order. Yet consciousness does not respond to force. It responds to conviction. A mind that keeps moving the scene is a mind that has not decided. It hovers between states, trying to arrive without ever standing still long enough to occupy the destination. Neville described imagination not as a cinema, but as a photograph of consciousness. A photograph does not explain itself. It does not move to convince you, it simply is. Its power comes from its finality. Compare this to a flickering reel, unstable and constantly shifting, never quite settling into one frame. One holds authority, the other suggests uncertainty. One declares, "This is so." The other asks, "Is this right?" Consciousness obeys the former without resistance and ignores the latter entirely. Modern language now echoes what Neville taught decades ago. Sustained focus creates coherence in the mind and nervous system, while scattered attention produces internal noise. When focus is broken into sequences, the body remains in a state of seeking. When focus is unified into a single impression, the body begins to accept it as fact. The imaginal act succeeds not because it is dramatic, but because it is undisturbed. Stillness is not emptiness, it is authority. Here is the hidden focus secret most never hear. Stillness is what makes the image obey. Not stillness of effort, but stillness of assumption. The moment you stop watching the image and instead rest within it, imagination shifts from performance to embodiment. When nothing is being fixed, nothing is being questioned. And when nothing is being questioned, the image no longer needs your help, it begins to express itself. If motion weakens the image, then stillness must be the doorway. And if that is true, then everything you have been taught about visualization must now be turned inside out. There is a reason a moving imaginal scene feels powerful while quietly producing weak results. Motion gives the mind the illusion of participation. It feels engaged, involved, busy. And the human mind has been trained to equate busyness with effectiveness. Yet imagination does not respond to activity. It responds to coherence. When the inner scene is in motion, attention is forced to track, follow, correct, and anticipate. Awareness splits itself across time, and in doing so, it loses the one thing creation requires: unity. Divided attention is not neutral, it is creative sabotage. Each shift in the scene pulls consciousness out of being and back into doing. The mind begins managing the image rather than inhabiting it. This is why moving scenes often feel mentally tiring. You are not resting in the assumption, you are working to sustain it. Power drains the moment imagination becomes labor. What feels active is actually fragmented. Consider the difference between a shaking security camera and a still surveillance photograph presented as evidence. The moving footage may contain more information, more angles, more data, yet it lacks authority. The still image, frozen and undeniable, carries weight. It says, This happened. No explanation required. Consciousness works the same way. A moving, imaginal act keeps asking reality to confirm it. A still image declares reality already has. Mental motion keeps the mind anchored in process. It suggests that something is unfolding, improving, or approaching. But manifestation does not emerge from process. It emerges from position. As long as the scene is moving, the imaginer remains outside of it, observing progress instead of occupying completion. The moment you watch yourself getting there, you confess that you are not there yet. Consciousness hears that confession clearly, even when the words are silent. This is why Neville Goddard warned so often about effort masquerading as imagination. Effort is always a sign that the state has not been accepted. True assumption is effortless because it is no longer trying to produce a result. It is resting in one. Motion sneaks effort back into the imaginal act under the disguise of creativity, but consciousness is not fooled by appearances. It responds only to what is assumed, not to what is rehearsed. When imagination moves, power leaks through the gaps between moments. Awareness jumps from frame to frame, never fully inhabiting any of them. Stillness, by contrast, collapses attention into a single point. Nothing is chased, nothing is adjusted, nothing is improved. The image is no longer something you are working on. It becomes something you are standing in. And only from that position does imagination command reality. If motion divides power, then stillness must concentrate it. The question is no longer whether movement feels engaging, but whether it allows consciousness to become whole. And that leads to a deeper realization. What exactly is being concentrated when the image no longer moves? At a deeper level, the power of a still image has nothing to do with visualization technique and everything to do with identity. A moving scene suggests that something is unfolding, but a frozen image makes a far more radical statement. This is already true. It does not describe how things happened or how they will happen. It silently declares who you are. And consciousness responds to identity far more quickly than it responds to intention. This is why the still image does not function as a story. It functions as a verdict. It is closer to signing a legal document than rehearsing an argument. An argument tries to persuade, explain, and justify. A signature ends the discussion. When the imaginal act becomes a single snapshot, it is no longer attempting to convince the subconscious. It is announcing a conclusion. There is no build-up, no anticipation, no unfolding sequence, only a settled position. The moment an image moves, it reintroduces time. And where there is time, there is delay. Motion implies that something must still occur before the state can be claimed. Stillness removes that implication entirely. The static image carries the weight of completion. It does not show you getting what you want. It implies that the desire has already shaped your identity. You are no longer acting toward a result. You are standing as the one for whom the result is natural. The subconscious does not reason in steps or sequences. It does not analyze cause and effect the way the conscious mind does. It responds to states. A state is not an action. It is a condition of being. When the image is still, the subconscious does not see a process. It recognizes a state, and states, once recognized, seek expression automatically. There is no need for persuasion because the language being spoken is identity itself. This is why Neville Goddard emphasized the phrase "I am" rather than "I will be." A moving image lives in the future tense, even when it pretends to be present. A still image exists outside of narrative altogether. It simply affirms. It says nothing, yet communicates everything. It does not ask reality to cooperate. It assumes cooperation as already established. When imagination is reduced to a snapshot, something subtle but profound occurs. The mind stops negotiating. There is no inner debate, no sequencing of events, no effort to maintain continuity. The image does not need maintenance because it is no longer a project. It becomes a statement of fact, and the subconscious, which is indifferent to logic but exquisitely sensitive to identity, responds immediately to that level of certainty. So the power of the snapshot is not visual simplicity alone. It is decisiveness. It is the quiet authority of a conclusion reached and no longer questioned. And when imagination speaks from that place, the question is no longer whether the subconscious has been impressed, but how quickly the outer world will reorganize itself to reflect what has already been decided. Sleep is the gate, and motion kicks you out. There is a precise reason the state akin to sleep has always been described as the royal road to creation. It is not because the mind is tired, and it is not because the body is relaxed. It is because in this threshold state, the impulse to do finally weakens. The mind loosens its grip on control, sequence, and analysis. Consciousness becomes receptive rather than directive. But this receptivity is fragile, and motion is the quickest way to destroy it. The moment an imaginal scene begins to move, the analytical mind re-enters. Motion requires tracking. Tracking requires evaluation. Evaluation requires separation. And separation pulls consciousness back into waking logic, where imagination becomes something you are using instead of something you are being. This is why so many people believe they are in SATS while unknowingly hovering just above it. The scene keeps them awake. The difference is subtle but decisive. Lying in bed and scrolling the phone feels passive, yet it stimulates constant micro-decisions. The mind remains alert, scanning, judging, anticipating. Compare that to staring into a dark ceiling with nothing to manage, nothing to correct, nothing to follow. The body softens, and the mind naturally descends. Stillness is not emptiness here. It is a surrender of authorship. And only in that surrender does the subconscious open. Motion, even gentle motion, signals to the mind that something is unfinished. A moving image suggests there is more to see, more to adjust, more to guide. The subconscious does not accept impressions under those conditions. It remains guarded, observing rather than absorbing. Stillness, on the other hand, communicates finality. The image hovers, not as a performance, but as a presence. There is nothing to follow because nothing is unfolding. This is why Neville Goddard instructed that the imaginal act should be allowed to hover without effort. Hovering is not holding. It is not forcing attention to remain fixed. It is allowing the image to exist without interference, like a thought that does not need to be finished. In this hovering, the conscious mind grows quiet because it has no task, and in that quiet, the subconscious receives. The analytical mind thrives on movement because movement gives it relevance. It can comment, correct, and participate. Stillness deprives it of purpose. There is nothing to analyze in a completed assumption, nothing to solve, nothing to improve. This is why the mind often resists still images at the threshold of sleep. It feels unnecessary, even uncomfortable. But that discomfort is not danger. It is displacement. Control is being withdrawn. As the body drifts toward sleep, consciousness naturally seeks simplicity. Complex sequences collapse, narratives dissolve. What remains are impressions, feelings, and states. A still image aligns perfectly with this descent. It does not ask the mind to stay alert. It allows awareness to sink into the assumption rather than hover above it. And when awareness sinks, identity shifts without effort. SATS is not a place where imagination must perform better. It is a place where imagination must interfere less. Motion pulls you back into authorship. Stillness allows the assumption to imprint itself. And when the image no longer needs movement to feel real, the mind no longer needs to stay awake to manage it. That is when the gate opens. And that is when creation becomes natural rather than forced. But if stillness is this powerful, the question naturally arises, why does the mind resist it so strongly, especially at the very moment it matters most? Stillness exposes something most people never notice because they rarely allow themselves to experience it long enough. When nothing is moving in the imaginal act, the mind begins to feel uneasy, almost threatened. This discomfort is not random. It is the ego's response to losing relevance. The ego survives through narration, commentary, and sensory engagement. When the image becomes still, there is nothing left for it to manage, and without management, it has no function. The ego mistakes motion for control. As long as something is happening internally, it believes it is participating in creation. Movement gives it a job. It can adjust the scene, evaluate whether it feels real enough, and decide if more effort is required. Stillness removes that entire structure. There is no sequence to oversee, no progression to judge. The ego interprets this absence of activity as danger, not because something is wrong, but because its role is dissolving. Neville referred to this reactive voice as the adversary, not because it is evil, but because it is rooted in sensory reasoning. The adversary depends on evidence, continuity, and external validation. A still imaginal image offers none of these. It does not explain itself or justify its existence. It simply stands. And that silent certainty feels intolerable to a mind trained to equate proof with movement. Imagine a child handed a wrapped gift and told to wait. The box is still. Nothing rattles. Nothing reveals itself. The impulse to shake it becomes almost irresistible, not to open it, but to feel something happening. The shaking is not curiosity. It is anxiety. The ego does the same thing with imagination. It shakes the scene through motion because stillness feels like losing grip on the outcome. Motion reassures the ego that it is still in control. It can tell itself that progress is being made, that effort is being applied, that something is unfolding. Stillness removes these reassurances. It demands trust without evidence, and trust is not comfortable for an identity built on observation and comparison. When the image stops moving, the ego begins to generate doubt, not because the assumption is weak, but because the ego's position within the process is being withdrawn. Doubt, in this context, is not logical analysis. It is identity withdrawal. The mind senses that it is no longer the author of events, only the witness to an already established state. That shift feels like disappearance, and so the ego reacts by reintroducing noise, questions, and motion, anything to regain relevance. The discomfort is a signal that the imaginal act is moving in the right direction, even though it feels like resistance. When stillness is maintained, something subtle occurs beneath the surface. Without narration, awareness deepens. Without movement, attention concentrates. The ego quiets not because it has been fought, but because it has been rendered unnecessary. And in that silence, imagination begins to operate from a level far deeper than thought. When the mind finally stops shaking the box, it discovers that nothing needed to happen internally for everything to begin happening externally. And it is at this point, when the image remains unmoved, that something invisible begins to move on its own. You stop moving the scene, so life moves instead. There is a moment in the imaginal act that marks a complete reversal of roles, though it often goes unnoticed. As long as the inner scene is being adjusted, refined, or guided, the mind remains busy orchestrating outcomes. It believes creation depends on its intervention, but when the image becomes still, something extraordinary happens. Responsibility quietly shifts away from the imaginer and into life itself. The scene no longer needs management, and because of that, events are free to arrange themselves without resistance. A static end image does not attempt to predict or control the path by which it will be fulfilled. It does not concern itself with sequence, timing, or logistics. It stands only as a declaration of the end. This is why it activates what Neville described as the bridge of incidents. The bridge is not built by conscious effort. It forms naturally once the destination is fixed. Motion interferes because it keeps adjusting the destination. Stillness locks it in place. The difference can be understood through a simple analogy. Chasing metal filings around a table creates chaos. The hand moves constantly, trying to force order through pursuit. But placing a magnet at the center changes everything. The filings reorganize themselves effortlessly, not because they are being chased, but because they are responding to a fixed influence. The still image functions in the same way. It becomes the magnet. Life does the moving. When the imaginal act is static, there is no attempt to micromanage reality. There is no inner commentary about how things should unfold or when progress should be visible. This absence of interference is not passivity, it is alignment. The imaginer is no longer negotiating with circumstances. The state has been assumed, and assumption is the only instruction reality requires. This is why movement inside imagination often leads to stagnation outside of it. Each adjustment is a subtle signal that the end is still uncertain. Life mirrors that uncertainty by delaying, detouring, or fragmenting events. Stillness, by contrast, communicates certainty without explanation. It does not demand signs. It does not seek reassurance. It stands complete. And from that completeness, the outer world begins to rearrange itself in ways the conscious mind could never design. Neville emphasized non-interference for this exact reason. The bridge of incidents is not logical, linear, or predictable. It unfolds through natural impulses, chance meetings, sudden decisions, and seemingly unrelated events. A moving, imaginal scene tempts the mind to judge these events, to label them right or wrong, to push or resist. A still image allows them to flow uninterrupted, because the end no longer feels fragile. Once the imaginal act becomes motionless, the inner work is effectively finished. There is nothing left to adjust because the assumption has already been accepted. The imaginer steps out of the way, not by effort, but by resolution. And in that absence of inner manipulation, life begins to move with a precision that feels almost intelligent. The paradox is simple but profound. The more you move the scene, the less life moves. The moment you stop moving it, life takes over completely. And this raises a final essential question. If the still image carries this much power, what must it actually contain to work so effortlessly? The mind has been conditioned to believe that richness comes from accumulation. More detail, more imagery, more sensory input must surely create a stronger impression. Yet the subconscious operates by an entirely different logic. It is not impressed by quantity. It is impressed by essence. When an imaginal scene becomes crowded with detail, the core feeling is diluted, attention spreads thin, and the state loses its density. A single sensory implication carries more authority than a complex sequence because it points directly to meaning rather than decoration. Think of how a signature scent can instantly evoke a memory, a mood, or a version of yourself without recreating the entire environment. The scent does not explain the memory, it implies it. And implication is the subconscious language. A full mental movie often overwhelms this language, burying the signal under unnecessary noise. Neville consistently favored implication over description for this reason. Description invites analysis. It encourages the mind to evaluate whether the scene is accurate enough, vivid enough, or complete enough. Implication bypasses all of that. It delivers the end state in a single stroke. A still image with one dominant sensory element does not ask the mind to build belief step by step. It presents belief as already established. When imagination focuses on fewer details, attention naturally deepens. There is nothing to manage, nothing to track, nothing to correct. Awareness sinks into the feeling tone beneath the image, rather than skating across its surface. This depth is what impresses the subconscious. Not the sharpness of the picture, but the solidity of the state it implies. The subconscious recognizes the weight of certainty immediately. Excessive detail often reveals an unspoken fear that the image will not be accepted unless it is explained thoroughly. But explanation is for the conscious mind, not the creative one. The subconscious does not need proof, it needs a signal of reality. One well-chosen implication does that more effectively than 1,000 moving parts ever could. The simpler the image, the harder it is to doubt, because there is nothing to argue with. This is why the most effective imaginal acts often feel strangely minimal. They lack drama, they lack narrative, they may even feel unimpressive to the conscious mind, yet they carry an unmistakable sense of finality. The image does not entertain, it establishes, and once established, it no longer asks for attention, it rests. As the image simplifies, something else simplifies alongside it, the sense of self. The imaginer stops trying to become someone else through effort and begins to recognize themselves in the assumed state. The image no longer represents a desire, it reflects an identity, and identity does not require detail to be real, it requires acceptance. When the imaginal act is reduced to its essence, the self no longer feels like it is reaching forward in time, it feels settled, present, complete. And in that simplicity, imagination achieves its greatest depth, not by showing more but by saying less. Time is not experienced equally in all states of consciousness. It stretches, compresses, and sometimes disappears entirely depending on where identity is placed. A moving imaginal scene keeps time alive because it implies progression. There is a before, a during, and an after. Something is unfolding. Something is not yet complete. Stillness removes that structure altogether. A frozen image does not move through time. It stands outside of it. This is why a completed photograph carries a different psychological weight than a live rehearsal. A rehearsal suggests preparation. A photograph implies arrival. When the imaginal act is still, it communicates to consciousness that nothing more needs to happen internally. The state has already been reached, and when identity accepts that position, time loses its function. There is no waiting when there is nothing left to arrive at. Motion always implies process. It suggests improvement, correction, and development. Even when the movement is subtle, it carries the message that something is ongoing. Stillness, by contrast, implies finality. It does not show the desire becoming real. It assumes reality has already conformed. This assumption is what collapses time, because time only exists to bridge gaps between states. When the state is assumed, the gap disappears. This is why manifestations often appear sudden or surprising after a successful imaginal act. From the perspective of identity, nothing new occurred. The change was already accepted. The external event merely caught up to an inner conclusion that had been reached earlier. Time did not accelerate, relevance did. Once the state was assumed, the waiting period ceased to exist psychologically, even if circumstances appeared to move gradually on the surface. Neville Goddard often spoke of creation being finished, not as a poetic idea, but as a functional truth. If creation is finished, then movement within imagination makes no sense. Movement would imply ongoing creation, correction, or effort. Stillness aligns with the idea that the work is complete. The image does not evolve because there is nothing left to add. When identity settles into a completed assumption, urgency dissolves. There is no pressure to check for results, no anxiety about timing, no internal countdown. These sensations belong to a self that is still moving toward something. A frozen image dissolves that self. What remains is presence, and presence does not experience delay. It simply is. Time dissolves most completely when the imaginal act no longer feels like a technique. Techniques exist to get somewhere. Stillness exists because there is nowhere left to go. The image does not push the future closer. It removes the future as a psychological category. What was desired is now assumed, and assumption lives only in the present. This is the quiet power of the static image. It does not hurry reality. It renders hurry unnecessary. And once time loses its grip on identity, manifestation is no longer experienced as a process. It is experienced as recognition. Yet beyond even this lies a deeper implication, one that Neville hinted at but rarely stated directly, about who or what is actually imagining at all. At the deepest level of Neville's teaching, the static image is not a method but a revelation. As long as an imaginal scene is moving, there is an implied separation, an observer watching something unfold. That distance may feel subtle, but it is decisive. Stillness removes it completely. The image is no longer something consciousness looks at. It becomes the position consciousness occupies. The moment movement stops, imagination ceases to perform and begins to rest. This is why a static image often feels quiet, even uneventful, yet strangely complete. There is no story to follow, no sequence to manage, no outcome to anticipate. The image does not entertain the mind because it is not meant to. Its function is not stimulation, but identification. Reality is no longer something you are waiting to experience. It is something you are being. And being requires no motion. When the image moves, the ego feels involved. It feels like a creator shaping events. When the image becomes still, that sense of authorship fades. There is nothing left to manipulate. This can feel disorienting because the ego equates control with existence. But what disappears is not power. It is the illusion of separation. What remains is awareness resting in its own assumption. Neville pointed to this repeatedly, though often indirectly. Imagination is not a tool you use. It is what you are. When the image is static, imagination is no longer projecting toward a future self. It is recognizing itself as already complete. There is no distance between desire and identity. The image does not say, "This will happen." It silently affirms, "This is so." The mirror analogy captures this shift precisely. A normal mirror reflects an image back to you, reinforcing separation. But the still imaginal act is like a mirror that does not reflect at all. There is no watcher and no watched. The image is not representing something external. It is revealing the state consciousness has assumed. Nothing needs to be verified because nothing is being claimed tentatively. This is where Neville's most radical implication emerges. God is not responding to your imagination. God is imagining as you. When the image becomes still, consciousness stops reaching outward and rests within itself. Creation is no longer something being attempted. It is something being expressed. Neville Goddard referred to this realization as the promise. because it ends the search. The still image is not powerful because it forces change, but because it reveals that change was never separate from consciousness. When imagination rests, reality rearranges itself naturally. Not as a reward, not as a response, but as a reflection of what has already been assumed. Stillness reveals the final reversal. Imagination obeys attention, not effort. When the image stops moving, identity settles and strain disappears. What feels done internally reorganizes life externally. As Neville taught, remain faithful without interference, and the assumption expresses itself naturally, without force or delay.